So thank you, and particularly thank you to all the people who've been with us for over these 2 days for sharing and exploring the incredible range of human learning systems that's been happening. 2 days worth of conversations about human learning systems practice, and nearly managed to get away with all that without hearing me present. But you're gonna hear from me for 10 minutes now. But very fortunately, I'm just essentially kind of setting up a conversation where Chris will be sharing a bunch of his practice and thoughts about creating rapid learning environments as a response to some of the complexity that we've seen around kind of COVID crisis. So where I'm going to start with this, one of the things that I think has demonstrated that coronavirus has demonstrated is that we live in a complex and uncertain world. So this has always been the case, but the coronavirus and our attempts to respond to that have brought that kind of complexity, the dynamic nature of the world, the uncertain, our limited ability to know what's best to do in that world. Coronavirus has brought all of those things front and center to us in a kind of unignorable way. And so it kind of forces us to ask a question about public service management. It forces us to ask the question, what's the most appropriate management strategy when the world is complex? Unfortunately, we've got a bunch of really good work to draw on to help us answer that question. So I've highlighted here the Cynefin framework produced by Dave Snowden. I think he might even be on this call, so you're always slightly terrified about referencing someone else's work when they're around in the conversation. So I hope I'm using this appropriately. But what the Cynefin framework kind of highlights for us is that complex and chaotic domains, which we've seen both of in the coronavirus context, requires a different type of management strategy. And I think that's one way to explain what it is that we've been seeing in people's response to coronavirus. So let's look at what public managers have stopped doing in the response to coronavirus. Well, for starters, funders of social interventions have offered flexibility by suspending performance targets and other kind of key performance indicators in their funding agreements. NHS England have turned off all the financial targets for the NHS for the year. CQC and Ofsted have suspended their inspection regimes. Department of Transport has suspended rail franchises. And if you look, and these are some examples of many of the public management practices that have been switched off in the last 3 weeks. And when you look at all these together, what you see is we're turning off the instruments of new public management because they're not helpful in complex environments. So this is a bunch of stuff that we've stopped doing. And what have we started doing? One of the things that we've noticed, and particularly in the conversations that I've been having with a large number of organisations over the last 3 weeks, is the creation of what we might call rapid learning environments. And what do I mean by that? I mean practices of daily recording of change by people who are rapidly rethinking and replanning how their world works. Creating weekly collective reflection on those daily observations, these kind of opportunities and acts of collective sense-making. And then using those collective sense-making processes to record and share that learning with others in a way that transmits this, this rapid learning across a system. So who have we seen doing this? So this is a set of practices I think came to my awareness from Chris's blog about 3 weeks ago when he was asking the question, who's putting learning alongside the innovation that's happening now. And so we see this in organisations like Audit Wales, like the Children's Society, like Children's Lives, like the Lankelly Chase Foundation, like the Australian Tax Office. I think there's a case to be made that Chris's blog from 3 weeks ago is one of the most influential blogs I've ever seen in terms of actually changing the practice that people do. And what's really significant about this work? Well, I think that there's two aspects to what's significant about this. Partly, those as learning processes generate insight that helps shape the future. So what we are learning through those processes is creating insight that will make the future look different. But there's also something really exciting, I think, about the way that managers have undertaken to create these learning environments. Because the way that we would understand this within a human learning systems context is what we're seeing is the reorientation of the focus of management towards learning. Managers are reframing the purpose of their work from controlling the staff who work for them into creating learning environments which enable those people to make better decisions and better act in complex environments. So one of the ways that we would understand what's happening through a kind of human learning systems lens is that the focus of management becomes creating these learning environments. And so question that I kind of was really keen for us to think about is how do we ensure the gains that we've made in terms of that change of focus of management, how do we make sure those stick? So one way that I was thinking about this is the question, how do we turn these rapid learning environments into learning infrastructure? Into the patterns of behavior that stick in organizations, into the information technology infrastructure by which stuff gets recorded, into the processes that by which organizations are just seen to run. So all that was by way of setting up Chris's presentation and offering a little frame around it. I think the really exciting thing today is to hear from Chris and the kind of rapid learning environments that he's been instrumental in creating.
Okay, over to me, is it?
Yeah, that'd be great, Chris. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Thank you. I'll just share my screen then. Let me put that one there. Share. Go back to the top there. And do that. Okay, is that available in front of everybody? Brilliant, thank you. I'll kick off then. Thanks very much, Toby. Thanks for that introduction. It's really good to be here. Just want to say, like they say, Audit Wales, I just want to explain a bit. Context is quite important on this. I work for Audit Wales. We're the main body that audit the public sector finances in Wales, local government, health, Welsh Government. So you know, people have a certain context of what an audit body is. I work for a part of it called the Good Practice Exchange, which is slightly unusual feature in the world of national audit institutions. We've got a specific focus on knowledge transfer and encouraging improvement. So learning is a key part of what we do. Lots of audit bodies are focused on the sort of look back, retrospective assurance. Did it work? Did people do what they want? You know, what they said they do. Whereas what we're doing is around actually, can we support some learning? Can we help people get into a better place? So there's sort of three words that our new Auditor General talks about, is that we're here to inspire, assure, explain and inspire. And that bit about, if you're going to inspire and explain, there's a big bit of learning that fits in that area. And that's where sort of the bit that I'm involved in, the good practice work, has been sitting for a number of years. I'll just move there. Ooh. Try that one there. So I mean, in terms of, if you want to get a hold of me, that Toby mentioned that blog, so via sort of What's the Pont, which is the name of the blog, and my email address, that you can get hold of me. And this notion of what we did to create a rapid learning environment. We never started out calling that, Toby, so I have to thank you very much. You've given us a name which we've adopted, so thank you. It was that fits perfectly. In terms of what we've done and where we've come from, there is a structure to this, which just to give a sort of help myself as much as anything, that I just wanted to cover sort of 5 areas about what we've done in this space, and just around the idea, never waste a crisis. That something's happened here, how can we make the most of it? And about sticking to some principles that we had about how we'd approach this. So working in complex systems, understanding that, stick to some principles that are relevant there. There's an idea that sort of, and Dave Snowden did a webinar with us a few weeks ago on that point about starting small and simple. And that's what we tried to do and stick to that, because there's no time to go in for the big bang. I don't believe in anyway. It's small iterative steps of the way. Learning our lessons as we've gone along, which is key in any system. And this bit about thinking about stickiness at the end of it, I want to come back to it, because there's a lot of people saying we're going to land in a different place. Everything's going to be different when we get back to normal. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but is it the normal, is it the new normal we want? And if there's going to be something different, I think we had to be a bit more purposeful in what we think that might be. So I just want to touch on some of that. Just thinking about context a bit more, history does leave its mark, and it's left its mark on me. One of the conversations I had early on in this was someone saying, I've never been in anything like this before, other than when I was on a ship sailing to the Falklands for the Falklands War, which I'm not quite old enough for that. But I do remember things that were big sort of national crises. And this one, the foot and mouth crisis that happened in 2001, I was working for the Environment Agency at the time, in the middle of that. And what happened left an imprint on me about how we learnt as we were going along, what happened afterwards. A couple of years before, I'd been involved in our last sort of major sea disaster, which was the Sea Empress, which ran aground in Pembrokeshire. And I say those things left a big imprint on me in terms of how we learnt, how we picked things up. I was very much at the front line of doing things in both of those incidents, and how that fed into what was happening as the incident was live, but also what happened afterwards. Loads of post-project learning, and you kind of were never sure from what you saw on the ground, how did that translate? And there's a phrase of retrospective coherence that creeps in here, that people remember things in a way that actually when you were in the utter mess of what was going on, it didn't quite pan out like that. Through the job I was being involved in Audit Wales, that I did a lot of facilitation work around post-project reviews and post-project learning. And I always ended up with a sort of sense of it didn't quite get out of them what we wanted. That sort of, there was I know I got to be careful what I say here, but the sense of sometimes that the notion of learning from failure in some of those bits is actually almost nothing ever went wrong. And you got to a point where what was explained was it all happened in a nice logical process. And if anything failed, it was always someone else's fault. So there's kind of these things have influenced me. And to the point where we've arrived now, that I think actually the time is here. Can we do something a little bit better? And can we think about building a better future? And that notion of, can we, is there a better way? And this notion of a rapid learning environment is surfaced. I mean, that's a lovely picture from Welsh and English, Ceredigion, the coast. I don't know if it was the coast path at the time being shut, but there were huge swathes of Wales shut during foot and mouth, as they were the northeast and the northwest. And figures, that if you're from anywhere near a rural community, I'm not sure that the impacts of that have gone away even now. But say that sort of industry leaving its mark. If Dave's there, hello, Dave. So this kind of kicking it all off. I spent about 18 months working on a secondment for Dave when he was up at the Cynefin Centre, was at Bangor University, linked with the psychology department. So also there was the Wales Centre for Behaviour Change. So I was kind of seconded out of Audit Wales because we were very interested in complex systems, but changing complex environments. So working with Dave on that. So this quote from many situations that I've heard Dave say it many times. It was that, when can we use it? And it fitted with my that history of, this notion, in a crisis, you deploy the innovation team alongside the business recovery team to capture that novel practice. And that was in my head, and as I sat down to write that blog, and that sort of, you know, how do we get that into this space? Interestingly, there were some lovely things. There's a webinar that David done with, I think it's Robert Koch from Eskom, the big South African energy company, talking about how they were deploying the innovation teams alongside their business recovery teams when things were going on, when there were outages on power there. And that was a webinar I'd heard last year, Dave talking to Robert, and that sort of how do you do that, and how does it happen in public services? And I'd raised it in a few places, and the only place where I was finding it was really happening kind of in normal times were in the so the emergency service, fire and rescue. And the fire and rescue would always say, yes, of course, we have a what do they call it, a fire ground incident review as it's happening, which they brilliantly called hot reviews, which I think only the sort of, you know, they could do. But that sort of has very much influenced me. And I say that point of what Dave said, how do we capture it? And it led into some sort of, if we're going to do anything, or, you know, what are our principles? There is a bit of retrospective coherence here. We've fitted some of these as we've gone along, but kind of 3 things here about principles for driving what we're doing at the moment. So no more cheese fondue, yes to Trojan mice, and be more human, which that makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Toby's nodding. No to cheese fondue, and there's a lovely picture of fondue there. This is basically another way of saying avoid retrospective coherence. And the fondue bit, there's a lovely paper that was written by some people in Swansea University, the medical school, which took the James Reason Swiss cheese model of failure, which, you know, nice sequential slices of cheese, failure happens all the way through, and that's, you know, an interesting model of failure. But the point they'd made was in lots of post-project reviews and other things, it's basically the fondue. All those slices of cheese get thrown in, mixed up, you gloop it around, and out comes this sort of like, you know, hot, burny bit of cheese that you try to consume. And actually, what do you get out of those lessons? They're gloopy, they're generic quite often, and they kind of don't fit with what really happened. And it's a really interesting metaphor for retrospective coherence. So if you don't like retrospective coherence, use cheese fondue. And that kind of principle, how do we avoid that? How do we get stuff captured in the moment was a key thought of what do we do here. Trojan mice, an idea around that. So it's the small, simple, safe to fail things that you need to try in this space, because you know, hanging on for the big perfect thing isn't going to work. But in a complex space, you look, you probe, you make sense, and you probe, you gather data to make sense. And the Trojan mice are the things you set free to try and gather that data to then sort of make some sense of what's going on. And that probing Trojan mice, I think, I'm hoping Neil Pryor's on the line as well, that we've had lots of discussions about this, that in lots of sort of public sector situations, you don't tend to see people trying or probing lots of things to make sense of a situation. There's the big Trojan horse of one project put forward. So we, that second principle about do these small, simple, safe to fail things to get some data to probe, to understand what's going on before you make sense of that situation. And then the third bit is, you know, why wouldn't this be there? We need to be human on all of this. And an idea, I say, coming back to where I first met Dave, was some questions around knowledge management. So there was a phrase that all knowledge transfer is a social process that is built on trust between people. So it's a contact sport. So if I know something and I'm going to share it with you, we really need to trust it. So trust each other to do that thing. So keeping those 3 things in mind, what do we start to build? And that's kind of where we came to. Where do we start? So this is very much a bit of our story. And there's some Trojan mice there. There's the idea of what, you know, how do we build a minimum viable product on this? And we started with some of those that were in the blog, those 3 questions of what's happened to you that's new or different? What have you noticed? Great. What have you learned from it? And let's have a probe around what might have failed. And we started doing that within our team, paper-based. We had one of our people was acting as the sort of collector and was interviewing each of us each week, and those broad questions, bringing it back. And the idea was we just had to share this with friends. And that blog post went out, I think it was on the 18th of March. And then kind of you go to bed and you think everything's fine, and then you wake up next day and like people have read it and sort of they keep reading it, and it kind of generates this sort of like, oh, there's something in this. And we then started to have questions about what if others want to join in on this, and there were questions about actually if there's something in here, how do we make it usable to everyone, but also something scalable. And kind of, I work for the audit office, and if we're going to make these are questions we always ask ourselves. If it's going to be scalable, it's got to be cost effective. And as those questions started to develop, there was a bit, but what are you doing? What's underpinning all this? So we had principles, and I've ended up sort of constructing this, which is, this is, if you like, the sort of basic unit of what we think is there as what's driving this kind of rapid learning engine, if you like. And it's a sort of hexagon with 4 compartments, and at the top of it there's this idea that out in the world at the moment there are emerging examples of novel and good practice. They're there, great, they're sitting there. If we can do something where we gather, analyze these and provide a bit of insight, great, we've got something useful, which I'll talk about in a second. But then if we start to share it back with people who can use that information, they get something out of it, but it also has its own impact. Is more people who are willing to learn and share with us, and the idea, and they've got more novel and interesting and novel ideas, and this thing starts to rotate. That we've got almost, I dread this, say, but the notion of a virtue of a circle of this rapid learning, and that's great. And you could do that. We were getting a bit of that on paper-based stuff with us, and thinking actually we need to move on from paper-based because we're getting more than we can handle. But where it got some traction was actually, if that's going on locally, are there things that you can lift out of it and see from a sort of look-down perspective? And some of that idea, if you extract some outputs, what's very attractive to us as in the world of audit is, can you draw out some broader insights? So if there's some useful stuff going on there, I work in the good practice side of things. Are there really interesting things that the waste collection operatives in one council doing around PPE and protecting themselves and the people they interact with that no one else is doing? Could that be transferred, that bit of knowledge around the system, so we're doing this kind of rapid learning? Great, that's that's the one element. The other element is, are there risks that are emerging that if we spot these early on, we could feed those back into the system so people can start to learn and avoid those issues. So if you like, it's a bit like anticipatory audit, that stuff goes in, helps them out. Great, that was one output. Another potential output was this idea of a real-time record of what's happening. So if it's happened now, it's there, it's fixed in that point, and there might be some element of avoiding retrospective coherence. I should say, in the dim and distant past, my first job was with the water company as a fisheries enforcement officer, which basically was given a truncheon, a pair of handcuffs and a police notebook, and I go and patrol riverbanks. And part of that, my police notebook became a really useful thing because that was my avoidance of retrospective coherence. I had to go to court. I've written stuff down in my police notebook. I was proceeding in a northerly direction up the riverbank, Your Honour, and I encountered Mr. So-and-so. But that bit about when you went to court, you avoided retrospective coherence because it was there, fixed in time. And that, it was, these things all go back. The other bit about connecting diverse viewpoints, getting some sense on all of this. I mean, if that little sort of cycle is running within our world of Audit Wales, that's brilliant. We get our view of the world. But actually, wouldn't that be lovely if there was something like the Wales Council for Voluntary Action had it from the world of volunteering? And actually, if we could lay data on top of each other, what could we see between them that actually might be really interesting things to lift out from a different viewpoint, where we might be seeing similar things? But it was that notion of, is there something in this that we can build a system that has got multiple utility? And that's where that was going. I mean, in terms of what we ended up, just say, moving through the gears on all this, everyone's seen this kind of the MV, minimum viable product idea of it. And we started talking about it. We had that kind of notion of this engine, and we were looking for opportunities to sort of, is anyone interested in this, and try to get a bit of social proof. Some of we ran a little bit of a trial, and one example came up that was kind of, you don't need these early wins or of an idea that sort of, what if you did this, what do you get? And there was a brilliant one came up around behaviours about recycling, that in some places they were, some of the waste recycling, they were switching off recycling because they said, we haven't got capacity to deal with it, throw all your rubbish in the black bin, and that's the end of it. Where other places were saying, no, carry on recycling and we'll deal with it in the depot. And the question, you know, it wasn't a criticism or anything, but it was legit to ask the question, saying, we've spent hundreds of thousands, if not many millions, on creating a certain set of behaviours around waste recycling, food waste in the food bin, plastic in the plastic bin, cardboard there. Suddenly we're switching it off. How do you get that switch back on? So it was a kind of interesting question we could drop into some of our networks. And that was a sort of a bit of an early win that people could say, oh, there's something in this. And there's also a bit of FOMO there. Fear of missing out is an interesting driver of behaviour. As more people talked about it, others joined in because we were talking about it. So it was around our networks. That was quite an interesting one. And there's a bit about, what if others don't want to join in? That's fine. I mean, people have got other thoughts on what works for them. No problem on that. But we are leaving the door open. If someone wants to join in with what we're doing, that's perfectly okay. In terms of, data, this is another thing nicked off Dave. But where we were looking at it, it was becoming obvious that we were going to start to get into a space where if we had those hexagons of different things happening, we were going to have lots of data. And what we were in a complex sort of environment, how do you make space? How do you make sense of what's going on? Collecting just numeric quantitative data was not kind of going to give us the insight in what we needed, and the notion of, you know, big data numbers with not much meaning. Some stuff about what we'd seen on our prototypes as well, where we had sort of specific, you know, just close kind of interview type stuff. Great, we were getting stickiness, meaning of what was happening there, but it was quite hard. What we were looking for in the middle was something, this idea of rich data. So you've got, it's the Goldilocks zone between the two. So we've got sufficient a scale of data, but the meaningness and stickiness stick with them. And that's where it led us to sort of, you know, we need to use Sensemaking around this to collect people's individual anecdotes and what they see in a way that we can start to use that to see these different sort of viewpoints and different lenses of the information. So what we did around that, I'm just kind of looking at multiple screens here, checking where I am. Cool, yeah. So what we do around that, we've used Sensemaker. So for some people may not be familiar with what Sensemaker is. So we've used it over a number of years with a number of things. I've used it quite a lot in spaces around staff engagement and staff surveys in a number of organizations, and perhaps explaining the context in big and thick data. I mean, lots of survey stuff that you typically see is very kind of big data. There's lots of numbers, quantitative stuff. And there's like a comment box at the end, which kind of gets left out. The other alternative around staff stuff was kind of focus groups in the thick data space. Not much, you know, you can do a number of them, they're great, but you don't get the coverage. Where we'd use Sensemaker, we were able to gather people's self-reported version of what it's like to work in a place, where they self-indexed it then, and we could use that as metadata to understand what was going on. So that told us the what was going on, the numbers, went back to the data to understand the why. And it probably is easiest if I just show you where we've got to and what we've developed as a sort of the basis of what we're going to use with our people to collect this data. I mean, the trials we've done of them, put their observations, but the plan is that they engage with their trusted networks to have these conversations, and we collect it through that. So I'll just scoot through these. I'm just conscious of, I've got no sense of time here. I'm okay, I think. Yeah, I am okay. Right. Yeah. So what we've done, so we built something in Sensemaker. This was interesting in itself. It's gone out to a number of people as clones of this site. So they're looking at it and they're putting their own data in with it. And we're trying to try that bit of mashing the data together. But in it, you get people's sort of what fits with one organization's use of words doesn't fit with another's. So it's so bear with us. This is constructed, this one, from the idea of how you'd look at it from sort of our relationships as auditors with the people we work with. So I should say, actually, why on earth is Wales Audit Office interested in this before I get into that? the point around why Wales Audit is interested in this. I mentioned earlier that we are, sorry, Audit Wales, why where we are compared to what we used to be. This idea of assure, explain, and inspire is a key part of what we think we can help add to the public services, and that notion of explaining how public money is being used. You know, I think it's a key part of learning for us and learning for others about how you interpret what's in front of you. But the notion of inspiring people to be better, the not transfer of knowledge and learning is a key part of that. So that's sort of why we're in this. The other bit about doing things together here is that if we're going to do any of that stuff, we need to build trust and mutual understanding of where we're going. So coming back to the human learning environments, there's a key bit, and I say that those Audit Wales sort of business objectives, or about assuring, explain, inspire, give a really helpful sort of handle to hang this on. There's another bit sort of fitting around why we're in, you know, an interesting space to do that. We have a bunch of people who've been trained and spend their lives looking at things, observing them, trying to sort of work out what's going on. So they've got key sort of skills around observation, analysis. There's a bit about being part of the audit office, which, you know, every year, audit independence and integrity is a big deal. So, you know, we're unbiased, we can sit back and take that view. So you link those two together and bundle on top of it. Actually, there's an element of availability at the moment that Toby mentioned earlier. Lots of organizations have switched off regulation and other things. Well, within our space at the moment, there's a you know, things aren't as normal. So there's people available to do some things. So we've got them, there's coverage. And as Audit Wales, we are kind of uniquely spaced across sort of 17 billion quid's worth of public expenditure in Wales. There's no one with quite that viewpoint. And I think, you know, sitting at the bottom there, and it's not kind of hidden away at all, but there was a deep desire to contribute here to this sort of Team Wales notion, that some of this stuff floated around on our internal sort of comms networks, and there were just people on it. We want, you know, what can we do? Where can we be useful? And amongst it, you know, lots of places, there's been a desire for organizations, how do we do our bit? And this was a sort of element of, you know, how do we do our bit in that space? So that was a bit of the way. I got my slides slightly mixed up there, and I'm going to kind of go to the next one. Yeah, so okay, just to sort of back to the Sensemaker stuff, what have we done? These are just some screenshots of what sort of float has been developed as how we're going to collect data around what's being learnt. The key to it all is this sort of first question. There's some kind of usual sort of stuff at the beginning, telling people how to use it. Some strong pointers there about please really be generous in what you share, and don't worry about this. They might not be relevant, because it might not be relevant to you, but it might be relevant to someone else. So trying to get people to share some stuff. We've got a few categories on it, as much as anything as a prompt, but the key is this question one is for people to describe anything basically they've seen new, interesting, or unusual in the last, you know, and we're saying this week on the hope that we'll keep it going. Get them to give it a title. It's something that we do in Sensemaking, and the people are incredibly insightful in describing a whole lot of stuff and giving it a sort of very insightful title, which helps as part of the analysis of what we've got. And that kind of sits as the main part. So where we were just initially asking the question, what's happened that's been new for you this week? We've asked that one. Bit of indexing then to sort of help sort the data. We're using 2 triads and two dyads. There's a bit about how these work is that people will be this hexagon in the middle turns blue, and people move it around to where they think it fits best. We're trying to get a sense of where they think, where the focus of what's been described. Was it just about individuals? Was it an organization doing its own thing, or wider society? No wrong answer on there. We want to see the patterns that come out. Some of the stuff initially, if there's stuff about just organizational objectives being met, you've got to wonder what's going on about people and the needs of society. There's a big one here for us in Wales. So we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So sustainable development is kind of built into law for us. So almost everything we do tries to get some sort of view of where people are around how they're behaving in terms of sustainability. So what was the focus of what described? Was it about environment, people or economics, if some of this stuff, as it might be in the moment, is just in the space of solving sort of people problems, you might be ignoring some of the environmental and economic stuff at your peril. So we want to see what kind of patterns come out there, and we'll use them to sort of get underneath some of the data. Then two others about just a sense of how people responded. Were they doing it proactively, or was it totally reactive? You know, there might be some things that have gone through those stages. Something around question 5 around the scale of change. Was it about adapting to what's there already, or people gone for something completely different? Just want to see what we've got there. I mean, that's sort of, you know, the notion of adapting what you've got, accepting things in a different environment. We might have stuff in that space, or people may have come up with completely different, truly innovative things. Don't know. See what we've got. Try to sort of filter the information. But having gone from there, the next sort of stage is, they've described it. We're prompting people then to think about, actually, you described it up there, you've indexed it a bit. What have you learned from it? And feedback we're getting that people go, oh yeah, kind of, this made me think, because there's a bit of, I've described it, let me just be a bit more about, let me give you what the learning points were. So this kind of collecting narrative in this box here about what was learned. And that's a really interesting one, because the indexing below is where we're hoping to draw out some of those rapid learning examples. So I said I was from Good Practice team, and there are two things, question 7, question 8, asking people to, on a sliding scale, categorize whether that was something that was, you know, only going to have a small impact, or they think it might have a significant one. Is it going to be local, or can it be widespread? And from the Good Practice team, our sort of cheap entry into the data of saying, let's pull out all the ones that are being categorized in this space of having a significant impact and going to be widespread. So we can just have a look at them, and are they the ones we can sort of do something quickly to get them spread out for people to have a look at. And number 9, which is an interesting one, is, do you think this is something that could be retained for the future? Because that one is appealing to a number of people, in that if there was a data set there that we could look at that said, actually, the audit office people have categorized these things of things that could be retained for the future, we probably want to look at. But are they the same bunch of things that the Institute of Welsh Affairs or the Wales Council for Voluntary Action or Welsh Local Government Association are also categorizing as things that they think should be retained for the future? So it's that point of going back to sort of, let's fix points in time where you collect this, because it doesn't get lost, because that, oh, we've got to keep this for the future. Are we, you know, let's not lose it in the heat of what happens over the next couple of weeks or months, sorry. So that stuff, those bits of category. There's a third bit we come into, and this is my mild obsession with failure, because failure is always an option. There's a lovely picture of a mug I've got. You know, the from this is the Kennedy Space Center. The issue of you can buy a mug with failure is not an option on it. There's a lovely picture on the internet with someone who's broken, which I do like that one, and I'm going to buy one just to break it so I can have my own copyright-free proto. Anyway, the bit about we've asked them what they asked. We asked people, you know, give us your information about what you've seen or experienced or know of that's new. What can be learned from it? Okay, just have another think. And we don't know if we're going to get much in this space, but what might have gone wrong there? And you know, just saying this is not a judgment, but kind of failure is a necessary learning part of what goes on, and you learn more from the small failures than any raving successes. And just see if we can get anything in this space, because I say I'm on a sort of mild personal mission to get us to talk about failure and put it out there more. And interestingly, when this was being pushed around, so it should be shared with some people who were going to potentially use it in their own organization. It was like, leave the failure out, don't put it in there, because we don't talk about failure. So we were kind of, okay, interesting. That possibly says something about your organization, but that's kind of in the one we're using. 2 dyads along this one, that were the one about if things would go wrong, you know, what happened? Was it about, you know, they just didn't progress it anymore, or actually did they learn quickly and move on? And if we get people in that territory, will we see any correlation with other things that pop out of the data set? And then the last sort of main question is, when this is all over, where do we think people are going to land? And it will be back in business as normal, or will it be a completely new world? And like one of the people who works with me, Sam, he's got a view that everyone's going to start up. Oh, cricky! Where am I gone? I think we're excited here. Sam's view is that they're all going to put it up there to start with, and as time goes on, they're all going to slide back to business as normal. And that kind of, you know, I've got some sympathy with that view, and I think that we kind of need to be interested to look at it, because that business of people saying it's going to be different, it's going to be different. Well, is it? And what is it? And how do we perhaps make that happen? There are 4 more questions at the end of this. 4, yeah, 4 that help us filter the data, because we think we're going to, you know, get quite a lot of it and make sense of it. But question 13 is just a sort of positive to negative one. There's one about number 14 about which sector is this from, which is just helps us for our internal purposes where we need to share it. And you never get those lists right. Number 15 is really useful, which is a kind of self indication of how important you think this information is. So if you think everyone needs to hear about it, again, we've got a quick entry into let's take the ones people think everyone should hear about as the really important ones. You know, but then it's worth looking at the lonely voice of just me as well. And then number 16, we've slotted this one in. As I say, we are interested in data quality and questions being raised about how valid is what's gone into this. So we've asked people to categorize it around where do you get this from, basically. And it was something I observed happening, which is kind of, you know, the gold standard, I suppose, from, you know, firsthand from people involved through to I was out walking the dog and someone said it to me in a sort of socially distant conversation or something, so anecdotal. So just us getting a bit of a filter about what we've got. And because it's internal, we can ask for some email details. So that's basically where we've ended up with. And sort of, you know, so far it's been round a load of tests. And I think that Beth Smith, who works with Dave, has taken a version of this and has adapted it and is making it available through for other people to use if they want to. So they can sort of go through the sort of learning that we went through. In terms of some of the stuff that comes out, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The data side of it, we'll be using dashboards for this, but this is something from analysts at the back end. So I mentioned you get sort of patterns coming out. This is an example from something we were doing on partnerships. We're asking about where was their key areas they were demonstrating trust around, and none of those options were wrong. But we were using that to sort of look at some people who were, you know, they were in theory supposed to do all of those 3 things, and it got some interesting conversations about what was going there. But I won't spend too much on it. In terms of, we are helping some other people develop their capability to sort of analyze the data to get it out. But the key point on it is any one of those dots, and this kind of is like a revelationary thing when you do it to people. You say, see that, or they say, what's that stuff in the corner there? That's really interesting. You know, what that there? And you draw a line around it, click it, and all the narrative pulls out, and they go, oh, so that's people. Those people are really interested in that bit. That's what they said. Yes. So you've always got the core data point where the data is taking you to something interesting. Click. Here's the narrative that explains it, and that, you know, the numbers tell you what. The narrative is explaining some of the whys. That's been really useful. Our plan on this is to sort of, and I have got a slide next, I think, is to share it locally, but we want to put some sense check in it as well to sort of make sure that what we're pulling out does fit with what's going on there. So this would be very much our plan is through trusted connections that we go back and share the risks, which I think this next one, yeah, this one is sort of, we're trying to, you know, what's the phrase? Gather, analyze, share, repeat is the stuff. But this idea of, in this sort of hexagon here, this is where stuff is being circulated, but what goes into it is our local teams are engaging to add data into that. We're drawing some stuff out on a roughly daily basis and sharing it with our CRE groups of managers to say, this is the stuff we've seen. This is the, you know, have a look at the data yourselves with you, because there is a sense of, having done this when we were doing lots of staff engagement stuff, a bit about people seeing it for themselves. When we went with sticky and learning, there's something about seeing it. What's that wet in the corner? What's it say? People go, oh, I believe it because it's someone like me said it. So we'll do that stuff on a weekly basis with our managers, and a kind of triage process there, that kind of local things that can go back into the local environment to feed that circle. And there's something in this about, when I showed that diagram, the bit about sharing, you know, we kind of, as a species, are terrible gossips. And there's nothing like, you know, what do we do when we pick up the phone? You're saying, have you heard about this? Or do you know about that? And that trading of knowledge seems to be something that kind of drives kind of the connections between us. So as this is not a kind of audit phrase about we're going to trade in gossip at all, but that trading of knowledge, getting into that space, that the conversations with those people saying, we've seen this, can it help you? And they, you know, hopefully they'll share some more. So there's that bit, stuff that comes out that's kind of on a bigger scale, that might go across sectors or you know, to the sector leads, but other stuff that might pop out into this space here, which might be other things that are worth sharing on a large scale. And I say, as from a purely sort of functional basis, that's where us as the good practice team are really interested about, actually, you know, we've got a program of stuff to do we fit in that space? And kind of, yeah, going back to sort of where this all started, I'm just conscious on time. Yeah, I think I'm right. Yeah, there's some of the key points on all of this. That and there's, if you like, that's our engine in the middle of it. What we've learned from it. I mean, a focus on learning. So throughout this, Toby talked about earlier about this sort of making learning part of what happens, you know, is management's preoccupation. Interesting, the language you've used on this at all, it's always been about learning, because that in the space of where there was a lot of stuff like audit, regulation, and inspection is going to be difficult in these times. Well, no one wants to hear you talk about that anyway. So getting into the point of how can we help you learn, how can we help you find the things that are going to help you better, has been help you get, you know, do things better, has been a really positive bit, and it has got acceptance of doing something perhaps different what we might have done in the past. The notion as well of relationships. So I say that there's always an angst that sort of you do stuff to people, and people would come along, and I think Andy Brogan and others in others of the webinars, but certainly in stuff I've seen Andy talk about with Jeremy Cox, is that the relationship is a kind of done to relationship. Well, this has been a kind of building a relationship on, let's kind of experience this together, and we'll only do this through our trusted connections that have an entry point where they can engage with people that they know. So for one example, one of our group have weekly conversations with board secretaries from organizations, so they're trusted relationships, they can build on those. So that has helped on getting this going. Speed in amongst all of this has been important to us, but with speed comes risks of sort of things falling over, but that's okay. I mean, when, you know, yeah, you just really deal with that as it goes, but getting stuff out there and to the point that people understand and can grab it, and utility, that sort of having built something that is kind of quick, people can see it works, you can demonstrate it to them, and we've had some quick outputs, you know, wins, have been useful, and I say has supported that bit about collaboration. So the notion of this is, you know, it's no accident it's a hexagon, because hexagons fit together very nicely, and that concept of people saying, you know, oh, if we had one of these, so we've been saying, oh, we'll clone this site so you can have one, and you'll have your own data, and wouldn't it be nice if we then started to share data to lay it on top of each other? And so far everyone's gone, yeah, wouldn't that be great? And I don't know if in some ways that's one of the sort of outcomes of the whole coronavirus thing, that people are saying, how do we, you know, accept, and let's think on something where we can collaborate more quickly, and this has been no different. So those kind of key some of the key points for me, which has been great. You know, it's taken us very quickly to a place I never expected from a blog post I stuck out on a Wednesday night. And stickiness, yeah, just to talk about this bit at the end, and it's this bit about people saying, oh, is this going to be different after COVID's sort of settled down? We're going to be in a new place. And it's, you know, and I'm thinking, right, yeah, we are going to be a new place, but actually, is it the place we want to be? And there's a bit of, you know, not unless we kind of perhaps do some purposeful stuff that makes it be the place we want to be. And I mentioned this sort of, I'd been with Dave up at the Wales Centre for Behaviour Change, when the Cynefin Centre was there, and I say that, you know, didn't sort of pass by without having an impact on me about various behaviour change methods, and kind of this, not to boil it sort of down into two things, but there's a bit about, you know, yes, appealing to logic and there's a rational side of stuff, that if we're going to engage in a rapid learning system on here, logically it's the right place to be now, and we've got people going, yes, why wouldn't we do it? And that's great, but logic doesn't, you know, in any behavior change stuff, doesn't apply universally or with lots of people, or convincing them it's the right way. And the other bit about boiling it down to says, you know, how do we stick some of this into the unconscious mind? And Toby said infrastructure, kind of same sort of direction I think I'm coming on this, is that how do we make sort of this process of sharing learning a habit, and something that people enjoy doing with their friends? And that kind of seems kind of I don't know, perhaps not the right words to use, or perhaps it is, but that idea of people actually having conversations with the people they're involved in an audit relationship to say, did you know about, oh, no, I didn't, that's helpful. Oh, by the way, have you heard about that? And so driving that relationship of sharing knowledge, so it's not some sort of standoff thing, which it's sort of, you know, it certainly has been in the past when I've spent a lot of my life in the world of regulation, and sometimes that's where it needs to be. But to build that rapid learning environment, it's an unconscious habit that people say do. I say friends, but do with the people they work with. So that's my stickiness thing, and that's the big sort of question I've got, because I think, yeah, an element of what we're trying to do is to try and make it, if you turn that cycle enough times, people have started to develop a habit. Is that right? And can we keep doing it? Because I'm not convinced we'll convince as many people as we can by logic. And I'm not quite into that sort of stuff about jumping the chasm when you've got 16% who are convinced by something. But that's kind of where I got to. That was my kind of key points on trying to wrap it all up about what we've done on our little journey. I mean, there is a crisis. We hopefully haven't wasted it. And I say those principles around no to cheese fondue, yes to Trojan mice, and being more human. We've tried to stick to some of that. The small start we've got there, we're doing small, simple things to try and get us into a space, learning the lessons we've gone and we've gone along, and we've got to something now that seems to be sort of having a bit of traction. And I say the big for me is about, we've got to get that working fully operationally, but then thinking about the stickiness, about things we take out of there, or the process in itself, but how do we get the things to stick?